Before the travellers lay a wide ravine, with great rocky sides to which clung upon shelves in narrow crevices a few thorn trees. The channel grew narrower and the river swifter. Now they were speeding along with little hope of stopping or turning, whatever they might meet ahead. Over them was a lane of pale blue sky, around them the dark overshadowed river, and before them, black, shutting out the sun, the hills of Emmenmail, in which no opening could be seen. Frodo, peering forward, saw in the distance two great rocks approaching. Like great pinnacles or pillars of stone they seemed. Tall and sheer and ominous they stood upon either side of the stream. A narrow gap appeared between them, and the river swept the boats towards it. Behold, the Argonath. Hello, I'm back. I'm William, and this is Basics with Blender episode 3. So today, as you might have heard in the description, we're talking about the cliffs themselves. So let's go back into that and see a little bit more about how they describe it. So, they're sheer, dreadful cliffs rising to unguessed heights. And it's dark and narrow, and Sam is a little bit terrified. And you'll see that it describes that it bends a little bit to the west before coming through. So we're going to start off by making some basic cliff sides. And then we will actually finally get into doing some texturing today. So texturing and materials and rendering and stuff. So that should be fun. So let's hop into Blender. And if you don't have Blender, if this is your first look at this, let's just hop into the browser. So at blender.org, you can download Blender. If you're using any of the 2.8 versions, it should be fine to work along with what I'm doing. If you're in 2.7 something, you might find things are very different. But it's free to download and use and everything, so don't worry about that. Okay, so if you saw in the intro and stuff, basically what we're going to do is create a more elaborate version of this. This was my test scene, which is basically a cliff face, and we're going to work on some water. And then we're going to add some materials and texturing and stuff to make it look semi-realistic. But we're also going to have the option to do it in two different styles. So this sort of semi-realistic and then stylized. So it's up to you. This is where your creativity comes in. I don't have my chat thing open. If you give me a moment. Okay, so we're going to start off fairly simply. So there's just, when you open up Blender, you should have your blank scene. I'm just going to start from a new one. And what we're going to do is we're just going to delete the cube, and we're going to start with a fresh new object. So we're going to, I haven't shown you this yet, but this is how you will add new objects to the scene. So under the add menu here, you'll see you get a whole lot of options. I think you can press Shift A, and then you'll get the same menu as well. So we're going to just add a plane. This is where you add all the different basic shapes. And I didn't turn the music back on. There you go. So we're just going to add a plane for now. And since we're working with a cliff, let's press R and rotate it along the Y. And if I just hold down Control, I can snap it to those values, or I can just type in 90. So I haven't told you that before. You can also just type in a number and it will snap it to that. So how are we going to take this into a cool rocky looking thing? Well, rocks are hard. I've experimented with them a lot, so we're going to start with the easy way. Shift A. So Shift A for add. You could also just type and go into F3 or space and search for plane, add plane. Just depends on how much you want to do. Or you just go up into this top menu over here. So what we're going to do though is, search is super useful. We're going to go to a website, a super useful website, not Blender, but cc0textures.com. So this is an awesome website where you can just download some free textures with no worries about any licensings or whatever. CC0 means zero attribution required. You can do whatever the hell you want with them. And from here, you don't have to use the exact same ones that I use. I just search for rocks or cliff, and there are a whole lot of cool options over here. And I downloaded 2 packs. You'll see why we use that now. But so I think it was this one and this one. But as I say, you can use whichever ones you like, whatever cliff face sounds appropriate to you for how you interpret the scene. And then if you just click on those, I just downloaded the lowest resolution one, 2K images, which is actually still decently high res. And that'll give you a folder or a zip file that you'll get a bunch of images. So you'll have a zip file with an ambient occlusion texture, a color texture, displacement, normal, and roughness. Have fun with that. If your PC can handle it, go for it. Though you're not going to see an enormous amount of difference, you'll just get a lot more detail. So you just need to download one of those packs. If you want to use the same ones as mine, I will copy them into chat for you. So this one and this one. You can just start off with one for now. We're not going to use all of these textures at once, so don't worry about it. Also, it might take a while for them to download, so that's why I'm saying maybe just go for the, the lower res ones for now. So let's start off with, I'm just going to use this one because I think it looks cool with this sort of sedimentary layered stuff. Unfortunately, you can't use substance in Blender directly. There is a plugin that someone has developed, but it's a paid plugin, and I'm not sure if it works properly or not. I don't have it, so I don't know. There's something about the legal things with substance and their stuff and whatever that they haven't released one. I don't know. I would love to be able to use it in Blender. Okay, so once you have those downloaded, what we're going to do is we're going to switch to our Blender. Oh, I'm still in Blender. And under the modifier tab, so we've been here before, just select your plane, modifier properties, add modifier, and we're going to add a subdivision surface. We've used this before. So this by default will sort of smooth out the mesh, but in this case that's not what we want. So you'll see there's two options over here. There's Catmull Clark and simple. So Catmull Clark does that sort of smoothing. You see that turn the plane into this sort of a circle. But if we go into simple, all it does is do a simple subdivide, so every face will be cut into multiple slices. So, and then I'm just going to turn up to maybe about 4. You can experiment with this depending on how your thing looks. So at the moment this is not doing anything visible to us because it's just a plane. Okay, so there are links that I've pasted into chat. Basically, there's this website called CC0 Textures. Just download this one for now, or find a rock pack on that you think looks cool. And then we're just going to create a plane. So we're going to add a new plane. So there's this little menu over here, add mesh plane. You can also get that from saying Shift A, add a plane. And then we're just going to rotate that 90 degrees. So you can just type 90 on the Y, assuming you remember the keyboard shortcuts for X and Y and R for rotation. I'm just breezing through this pretty quickly, sorry if it's too fast. And then we're just going to add a subdivision surface modifier. And we don't want it to like round out the plane, so we're going to turn it on to simple, which just does a simple mesh subdivision. And I'm just going to put that up to 4 for now. So when you download those rocks from that pack, you should get like a zip file with I think about 5 textures, just depending on which thing you downloaded. It should look something like this. And yeah, so I downloaded 2 packs, 22 and 28. But you can just search for rocks or cliffs and whatever and find whichever one suits you. Okay, because this is going to be the easy way of making a cliff face. So let's pop back into Blender. And now to start using those textures, I'm going to create a new modifier, and you'll see under the form you'll find a thing called displace. So the reason why we're adding the subdivision surface is because a plane is just one face or 2 triangles depending on how it's set up. So we want to subdivide that to get a lot more detail on there, because now we're going to use the textures to push out the surface. Now you can just leave it in the stack. You can just shrink it down if it's getting in your way. The nice thing about that is you can always go back and add more subdivisions or shrink it down depending on how things are going. So that's why modifiers can be really nice. It's non-destructive. So then under the displace thing, at the moment it's just pushed it all out. So we just need to find the textures. So you just go where it says new, under texture, click that, and that will add a new texture for this to reference. Unfortunately, they make it so that you have to go to another place to get there. But there's a simple button over here, right on the right hand side after you've said new, which says show texture in texture tab. So what that does, it takes you to this little tab in the bottom here, which is where you will find what this image will be. Hey, you're entering the contest again. That reminds me, there's a giveaway going on. So you type in either of !enter or !ticket, as you might see in chat now, and you'll be entered into the draw to win Prison Architects when I get to 50 followers. Okay, so under the texture tab, we're going to load the textures, but you can also use Blender's built-in stuff to create procedural textures, and we are going to do this a bit later. But to start it simply, we're just going to say open under the image and find wherever your texture pack is downloaded, and you're going to have to extract your folder. Forgot to say, if you haven't done that, extract your zip. So I have mine in here. Oh, thank you, Dean. And then what we're going to use is the displacement texture, because that's specifically designed for this. And just open image, and you'll see that already something has happened. But a little trick that is useful is, since this is one of the weird quirks with Blender, is we're using this as a displacement map. So we're not actually interested in the color, we're interested in the data in it. So you'll see at the bottom here there's a thing called color space, sRGB. Click on that and select non-color. Now in this case it didn't make any difference, but depending on the file format and the use of the texture, it's kind of good to switch that to non-color. We'll see later in some of the other textures that it will be a big difference. You only really want it to be on color data if you're actually using it for specific colors, so like color texture and stuff. Okay, so we get some changes over here, but it's not looking amazing. So if we go back to the modifier tab, let's pump up our subdivision to something a little bit higher. And let's also right click on it and say shade smooth. And you'll see we get a little bit more detail and it starts looking interesting, but we've got way too much of a spike over here. So for that, let's just lower the strength down a little bit over here. Depending on what texture you're using, you'll want to have your strength at something different. For this one that I'm using, let's go for 0.2. But it's still really low resolution looking thing. This is another reason why I said don't really need to download the 8K pack, because we're not getting that detail yet. So either you can go into your subdivision thing and keep on pumping up these numbers, or you can just add another one if you want, because it naturally only allows you to go up to 6, but then once you type in a number you can go way higher. But if you go super high, you're going to find things start slowing down like crazy. So you definitely don't want to go as high as 10 unless you've got a beast of a computer. Oh yeah, I should have explained that. So there are these two values over here, render and viewport. So render means it's going to use that number of subdivisions for the rendered version, and viewport is what you see. Yeah. So viewport is this version. So if I change this, that's what we're seeing, and when I change the other one, you don't see anything changing. That's because it will only affect the rendered version. We haven't done any rendering yet, so we'll still get to that today. But I've noticed that this texture is got the sort of what do you call it? The layers, or sedimentary layers. Yeah, going in the wrong direction, so I'm just going to rotate it again on the X 90 degrees just so it looks more natural. Yeah, so that looks alright. But this isn't exactly a cliff now, is it? It's just one little patch of cliff. So now we can make things a little bit interesting. So let's go into edit mode on this. You can rotate the texture itself, but at this point it's just easier to rotate the object. We're going to go into that sort of stuff a little bit later. It's just easier to do the whole object for now. I will explain that later. If I don't, remind me. And I think something that would be useful is, since we're actually happy with, well, we're going to do a whole lot of stuff with the texture coordinates and stuff, so don't worry about it, because we're going to make new mesh. So that's part of what we're going to do now. So we like the way this object is now, and let's not have it think that it's rotated the whole time. So we want this 90 degrees thing to be its standard rotation. So I'm just going to select the object, press space to search, or press F3 if yours is not set to space, and I'm just going to say apply object transform. So you see what happens when I do this is those numbers will become the default. And you'll see that things have gone all sorts of weird over here on our displacement, but that's fine. That was to be expected. Because in fact we're going to turn off the displacement for now. That was just to get you excited. Ah, Glenn. I think that was that other texture that I downloaded. Was it not this one? With a 45 degree rotation. But it's fine. It'll look a little bit weird for now, but we'll get to that. 26. I just want to see which then. Just curious which textures people are using. Do you have your object selected? Oh, if this thing is not showing on the right hand side, you just need to press N. And then select the item thing over there. Look at Glenn being helpful. So now we're just going to be a little bit creative and go back to that sort of stuff later. So I'm just turning off these modifiers for now. So there, where these two things that look like a camera and a screen are, I'm just turning them off, just so things go a little bit faster while we're working. I'm also going to do that with the subdivision surface as well. And then I'm just going to go into the edit mode, select edges, and extrude edges to make something looking fairly interesting. What I am going to do though is I'm going to try to keep these faces all semi-square, because imagine that that texture that we're using is going to fit over each of these squares. So we don't really want to go and have like little blocks like that. Otherwise, with the way we're going to use it, it's going to get a little bit distorted. So they don't need to be perfectly even, but let's just draw out some sort of surface, a little bit of a winding river. So in the description in the Lord of the Rings for this cliff path, they say that it bends slightly to the west, but they're traveling south, so bending to the west means it bends to the right. I know that means nothing if you don't care, but I'm trying to be slightly accurate to the story. And then I'm just going to select all the ones that I create, and I'm going to just Shift D to duplicate. And then we've got our sort of second bank of the cliff. And then you can make your river however wide you want it to be. So I'm just going to go into top view with numpad 7. Back into X-ray, so I can just grab all these things and use that to just sort of change the shape of this a little bit. And don't worry if your faces end up being not perfectly square, so long as they're all just fairly even in size. And you don't have to make yours look like mine, I'm just making it look like this because this is how I'm imagining it. You can also make things get a little bit taller at different points. In no way do they actually describe how tall the cliffs are in the Lord of the Rings. They just say, what was it? Dreadful cliffs rising to unguessed heights. So, however you want to do it. So if none of this has made any sense so far and you want me to just repeat it, I'm just going to go through this all over again. And if you're just joining in now as well. So I'm just started off by saying Shift A, or went to the add menu to say add a plane. I rotated that along the Y 90 degrees. And I'll get back to those modifiers because we'll still add them again later, but I'll just do them now. So I'm going to add a subdivision surface set to simple, boost up these numbers a little bit higher, and add a displacement to it. To that, you would normally say add new, but I've already got it over here. As I said, yeah, you want to turn these off when you're working on it, especially if your numbers are higher than like 2 or 3. So under the texture, we just want to open up the image that we have downloaded from cc0textures.com, which in this case for me was this one. So I'm just popping that into chat so you can check it out. And from that, we're just using the displacement texture in this, which gives us this displacement. But we're not using that immediately, so don't worry about that. So I'm just going to actually just destroy these. We can always add them on. If you want to move everything along a certain axis, remember you can just go G to grab and put it along the Y. So when you do the extrude, you can select an edge, press extrude, and then press Y. And that will stick it along the flat thing. If your things have gone all wonky, so say you've done that and it's going like this or something, you can alt select each edge loop, so the top and the bottom individually, and scale them along the Z until you get something that looks a little bit more normal. Well, natural. So we're just extruding edges from this. Yeah, you can also, that's actually a pretty good way to do it. Select all your edges, and you can just set their height to 0, but it doesn't like it for this case. Let's see, because it sets them as an average. You can possibly do it for individual, maybe. Interesting. I've done this before where it just put them all at one height. Sometimes these things confuse me. But essentially, if you do scale on the Z, it'll just set them all to scale to one height. Yeah, that's what I thought, but it doesn't seem to be doing that now. I tried setting it to all the individual ones, but I can't think of a solution to that right now. It's not something I plan to do. So I'm just making this slightly windy river. Let me just turn off snapping. If you like the shape of your thing, but you're finding that you're getting these faces where you have things that are a little bit stretched out and they're not that sort of squarish shape that we wanted, just remember the add loop thing. So that was Control R. So we can do that to add a loop in there to make it look a little bit of a square shape. And as I said, I'm just going to select them all and say Shift D to duplicate, and then get a second side. And then I'm just going to slightly change it so it's not a direct duplicate. And you can also just shift select either end and extrude both of them, so you can just get this going along the line. Well, that's essentially what I was doing, scale on the Z to 0. But yeah, in a really more streamlined way. Thank you, Glenn, for being better than me. So I'm just going to add a little bit of height variation on this. But yeah, it's basically just scaling it on the Z to 0. So we haven't been really working with correct scale now. Oh, I just noticed that mine are slightly inclined to the side. So let's just stretch this one out to the other side a little bit. So I don't know how tall this is. This is saying it is 6 meters tall. Well, it shouldn't be. Let's make it, scale it up so it's 50 meters tall. That sounds about right. What a strange song is going on. Okay, so you'll have something that sort of looks like a cliff path. We're not going to work on anything either side of the cliffs because, well, unless you want to, but I'm imagining this thing will be rendered from within the cliff. If you want to, you can always go in here and add stuff on either side by extruding these edges and stuff, but I'm not going to be doing that. We're going to keep it simple. So if we go back and add back in or turn back on, depending on how you did it, your subdivision surface and your displacement modifier, things might look okay, things might look horribly stretched. Just depends on how things are or how you made those edges and things. In my case, it actually looks mostly okay. If you're finding that you've got edges that look just like certain faces are horribly stretched, what we're just going to do for this case, which is why we wanted these to be sort of squarish. I mean, mine aren't squares, but they're similar scale. Just select all in edit mode and say you have to be in object mode. So in edit mode, you'll see that you get these settings, but if you're in object mode, so just press tab, you'll see the dimensions. Hopefully that makes sense. Oh, one thing I also just noticed, the cliff on the left side looks fine. It's getting crushed in, but on the other side it's getting displaced into the river, which looks weird. Thanks for the tips. So in the edit mode, I'm just going to select all these faces. So I'm going to face select, so you can press 3, and I'm alt clicking on one of the edges, and I'm going to say face no, mesh, normals, flip. So now if I go back into object mode, you'll see that now it's displacing in the correct direction. And if you're having some of your faces are all stretched out, I was trying to get to this, we're going to go to UV and we're just going to say reset. Because what this will do is it will set the UVs of each of these faces to just be the square of the image. So they're all going to take up the whole image. If your thing looks fine, you don't need to worry about that step. We're just sticking with the basics in this, so we're not going to work on fancy UV stuff today. But actually this is where we'll get into a little bit, like Glenn, you were saying that your texture is 45 degrees rotated. And mine has got the 90-degree rotation. And it's too late to actually flip it, which is why I originally did that as the first step. So just go into edit mode, select all your faces, or any faces that look wrong. In my case, all of them are rotated vertically. And now we're going to do the first time of going into another editor. So right in the top corner, you'll see that there's a little drop down over here. We're currently in the 3D viewport, but we're going to go into the UV editor. And since our thing is just a simple square, because I reset mine, you should just see something similar to this, or you should see something that looks like a replica of your stretched out cliff, just depending on how you did that, because I've already reset mine. If you want to match your texture to your mesh, you want to, at the top here, find the displacement texture that we used. Use the middle scroll wheel to zoom out, and then you can sort of see what the texture looks like. In this case, it's a little bit hard to see because it's quite a bright map, but you can just select all and then rotate it if your thing is like 45 degrees. These are tiling textures, so you shouldn't have any issues. In my case, I just want to rotate it 90 degrees because that's how it looked wrong. Yes, do that. Oh yeah, don't forget there is a Discord server. I'll post that in link if anyone wants to post their stuff on there. Oops, I didn't mean to have OBS open. Just press A. A is always select all. So if you want to see what you've done, just switch back to the 3D viewport. You can actually see both of these things at once. So if it's a little bit confusing, what we can do is we can add a second viewport. So if you just go into the top right hand corner and left click and drag, you can pull out another viewport and then switch that to UV editor. This way, if you have your object selected, you can see what's happening over here. So you can only get all these things selected if you're in edit mode. If you're not in edit mode in your 3D viewport, nothing will happen there. So make sure you're in edit mode and then select all your faces in edit mode and then select all your faces in the UV, and then you can rotate them however much you need. Hopefully that helps. So I'm just going to turn down the strength of this displace. Let's see. So it looks to me like you have maybe extruded an edge of 0 width. So it's got a bit there that it's trying to do a whole lot of displacement on that it doesn't have any width on. So what you could do is either select that and try space it out, or do the thing that I've showed you before. Just go into the edit mode, select all the edges and say merge by distance. So go into search, or you can just press M and say merge by distance, and just keep that a really small number, and you should see that as long as you don't go to a huge number and merge all your faces, it'll just merge the things that are a little bit too close. Was that the issue? Sometimes it's hard to see these things. Cool. I'm glad it's fixed. So if you have got your UVing and stuff sorted, you won't need this viewport anymore. Oh, you're the best. So you can just right click in the gap over there between the two and say join areas, and we just want to join them together to use the 3D viewport into that one. So just move it across to the right, just so you got more space to do stuff. You figured it out. If you want to do invert on the other side, the thing that I did where it was displacing wrong to the other side, make sure you're in face select, alt click on an edge, we'll select the whole side, and then under mesh, normals, flip. I'm doing the menus because it's easier to make sense of, but you could also go into search and say flip normals. So if I do that, you'll see that now that side flips. Cool. So you should have something that looks fairly rough like this, but somewhat cliffish, but not perfect. So this is actually why I downloaded 2 packs. It's not necessarily the optimal way to do things, but I'm going to add a second displace with, yeah, exactly, with a new texture. Do the same thing of go to the texture place, open it, and then I'm going to find the second texture pack and add that texture in. So at this moment you'll still have a lot of repetition, but don't worry about that, we will fix that just now. So you'll want to have them fairly low at this point, because when you're combining these you'll get weird looking things. And if you find that it sort of starts to look like it's sort of making these round bulbous looking things, that's because it's displacing on the already displaced stuff. So you can just say displace, instead of along the normal, just displace it along the X, I think in this case, no, Y. I think that's because I didn't apply the, oh wait, Z. It's because I rotated the object, so these coordinates are a little bit messed up. That's why I said you want to apply the object rotation. So then you won't get that sort of bulbous displacement, because it's now just going to extrude it in, well, displace it in one direction.
Embarrassing!
Hey, I redid it from start because I wanted to explain to you. So then you should get sort of this combination of 2 of these. And you can put them to whatever strength you want. You're still going to get a bunch of repetition over here. So how we're going to fix that is, you'll see that there is a thing called a vertex group under the displacement modifiers. So what that does is this allows you to apply these displacements to individual areas. So what we can do is we can make sure that your object is selected, go into edit mode, and you can go into either face or edge or vertex select, doesn't matter which, and just select a bunch of random vertices, either at random or however you want. I'm just selecting a handful like this. We will. Thanks for joining in. So you don't want to have them all selected, but just like a random subset of them. You can also say select random, and that will select a random percentage of these things. Jeez, I couldn't do my Zoidberg. Lame. So once you have a few selected like that, there is a little the thing I think we've used before this, the object data properties. So it looks like a triangle with little vertex corners, and there's a thing called a vertex group. If you remember, that's what we were looking for. So if you click on plus, that'll add a new vertex group, and we're just going to assign the selected vertices. Double of the same. So when you create the new displacement thing and say new texture, it just assigns it to the same texture. Even if it's a different texture thing, it uses the same data. So just go into that and select the one and change it to another texture. And that should fix the problem. So in this case, to apply this vertex group to this, I'm just going to do it to one of the displacements, because that way we can have the one main displacement, and then clicking under vertex group, select the group that we created, and you'll see that things do change, but it's kind of hard to see because the strength is pretty low. But now we get that. I'm just putting it up really strong so you can see some bits where it's stronger, some bits where it's weaker. Of course, if you have more detail in your mesh, more vertices, you can get more variation in this. We're just keeping it really simple for now. But this sort of helps get just a little bit of variety in here. Have you figured it out? I see mine is also doing this. Let's just double check this. Yeah, I see what you mean. Mine is doing that. It wasn't doing this earlier. Let me just double check. So what you want to do is, in that case, there is a thing over here where you might see a 2 saying it's being used twice. If you click that, it will create a single use texture. And then if we go and just select the other one, the other texture, it should swap. Why is it doing this? This was working just fine in my other one this morning. Let me just check this. So make sure that the one has got, oh yes, this is the problem. You want to have one with texture selected and the other with texture 1 selected. Derp, this is my fault. I didn't check this at the start. So you want one with texture and the other with texture 1. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And since one of them wasn't being used, it was just defaulting. So you should have the one with the one and the other one with the other. Let me just find. Wait, which one's which? Damn it, Glenn, you're confusing even me. Texture 01. Wait, why is it switching? What? Just give me a second. I'm tired. I'm just gonna save this and just check something. Why is this being funny? And I just noticed this one did actually revert to that, and I didn't notice that. Next step, ignore it and move on. Honestly, I don't know what's going on. It's something to do with making it into individual texture blocks. Oh no, that was the same one. Keep on forgetting which one I'm using. Ay, ay, ay. What is going on here? Okay, yeah. So let's just ignore this and move on. Frustration. I will figure out what was going on here, but this is annoying. But anyway, we can still get variation between two different intensities of the same texture, even though that's not what we were looking to do, but whatever. I'm a little bit mad now. And actually I'm using the one that I didn't want to use. Which step? I've now confused myself. I am just setting this to the right texture. Oh, the vertex group stuff, right. So, just let me set these things. Okay, so you want to go into edit mode and just select either manually, just randomly like this, select some random vertices or edges or faces or whatever, doesn't matter. Or you can say go to vertex and say select random, and then just select random like that. And then with those selected, under this little green triangle here called the object data properties, click the plus under vertex groups, which will create a new group, and then assign the vertices that you've got selected to that. Then under the modifiers, the displacement, doesn't really matter which one, but just one of them, select the vertex group in that drop down. Technical difficulties. It's okay. I feel like we're all struggling tonight, even me. And my cliff is also again rotated. So let me just go back. I think I rotated it back at some point because I was demonstrating it. It might be how far you've zoomed in, depending on the settings that you have. Yeah, you might have scaled it up to 5,000 meters or something ridiculous. Or you might have one of the preferences under settings for auto depth or auto perspective might be set on, which auto depth I think changes how it zooms depending on how you're doing things. So it might be that, I don't know. Oh, that's why it wasn't rotating. Derp. So we want to set under the displacements, instead of under texture coordinates local, we want to use UV. That's how you'll get your rotated textures. It should just use the built-in one. Yeah, you might have turned on one of those features. So let me, not Haiti, just add a little bit of more detail to my mesh here. Actually, no, what I'm going to do, I just put that way too high, is I'm going to add a second subdivision, because you'll see that because we've been simple subdividing, these edges are getting really sharp creases. We want to add a Catmull-Clark subdivision in there. And I have just broken Blender because I've been stupid. Today's going slow. Today's a slow day for me. My brain is being distracted. I have crashed Blender. So let me just discuss if stragglers have joined in while my Blender figures out what it's doing. So we're working in Blender. I do have a Discord channel where you can post your things and get help and stuff. And then in Blender we are using textures from cc0textures.com to displace cliffs that we're then now going to detail up and start going into the material stuff on them. Okay, my Blender has completely died. I'm gonna have to end task. That's annoying. This is why you don't want to turn up your subdivisions more than so many. A default 8 or whatever. Just kill it. Yeah, you don't really want to use more than like 6 or 8 subdivisions. Even then, that's a little bit high. Okay. Let's go to get somewhere over here. Okay, so if you were getting those candy floss fluffy things, remember that's because of the displacement direction. You want to switch that to another one, otherwise it's going to just displace it along the previous normals and you'll get these sort of fluffy, blown out looking clouds. So if you do it to just mess around with the X, Y, and Z, in my case, because I didn't rotate or apply the transformations, I have to use the Z. But if you did, you would use, I think, the X. What have you done? It looks cool, but you have so many subdivisions on there. Looks interesting. Looks like marble. Okay, so you can still work with that if your computer is working with. My thing is looking a bit weird because I've now loaded up a old save, so let's just ignore that for now. Let's move on. So what we can do is now start adding materials and stuff, because as this is, we've just got some surface stuff. I'm just going to delete the side so you can see other stuff because it's not looking great. So I'm going to work with the side, you don't have to worry about it. I'm going to add a second subdivision surface, but I'm going to have this not high levels, but this is just I'm going to move it above both of the displacements. And this one I'm going to keep on Catmull Clark so we can get some nice smooth shapes over here. I'm going to actually put this a little bit later like that, just so it smooths out some of these edges that I added over here. When I put one up, I'm putting the other one down so that we don't get a million additions of stuff over here. See how that sort of just rounds out the shape of the cliff. And one more. See, the more detail you add, the more awesome it will look, but also if you look right at the bottom, this line at the bottom, it'll show you how many faces and vertices you're getting. And when you start getting into a million, then yeah, it can cause cuck. So we haven't worked with any of the other 4.7 million. Yeah, that's crazy. More than a million, unless you've got a great computer, is pushing it. So let's look at materials and rendering and stuff. We're going to detail this cliff more later, but I think it's fun now to go into detailing. Like, you'll see that this repetition is still here. Let me just mess this up. Get rid of some of that repetition there. Sorry, it was annoying me that it repeats. Sorry, I'm getting distracted over here. Stop, William, stop. Okay, so on the top of your settings over here, where we've got the little circles, we've mainly been working either with the wireframe or the standard rendering viewport, but there is a rendered preview setting, right? The last one. If we click on that, if your computer can handle it, it'll switch into the rendered preview thing. In this case, there's not much going on. That's because we've got a basic light in here, but it by default is not a sun. So in the outliner over here, just select your light, and under the object data properties, which for the light will change it into a light icon, click on sun, and by default it will be at like 1000, which is completely wrong for a sun. You just want that to be like 1 for a sun lamp. And then you can press R to rotate your sun around however you see fit. I believe in the story they say that it was past noon, and since they were going out into the west, the sun would sort of be pointing out like this. I don't know. If you don't have a light, you can say add light sun, and that'll add a sun for you, and then you can rotate that around. If you already have one, either change it to a sun or delete it and add a sun. Basically the same thing. So what a sun does is it gives you a light that replicates the sun. So it's just directional. It doesn't come from a specific point. It's just infinitely far in the distance. Whereas the default point light comes from a single point and will only light up a tiny little area. So that's why you want it to be in the sun. So I'm just going to have it at a really steep angle, because then you get some really cool shadowing and stuff, which makes your displacements look more interesting. So we're going to be working with Eevee at the moment, which is the default renderer now in Blender. It's the FOST one, but we might switch it to cycles at another point, which gives you more realistic stuff, but yeah, I feel like they should indicate it with like the line of the sun goes out from the object as well. I don't know, because they recently did add a new environment sun thing, so like they have been working on the sun, but they haven't changed that. I mean, I'm used to it, but I think new people would find it confusing. So it's not like the sunlight is coming from this point in the scene. It's coming from, if you looked up at the edge of that and infinitely far away. So you're just setting a direction, you're not setting a point. So yeah, we're working in Eevee. For the moment it's quicker, but when we do some renderings and stuff, we might go into other things. So now let's, if you've got that working, finally add a material to our thing. So you'll see if we go to the Material Properties tab with your object selected, there's no material set up. So we're going to say New and add a new material. So you can give it a name if you want, but in this, as it is, we don't need to worry about that really. And now you'll get, by default, the principled BSDF shader. Let me see if I can remember what that's called. It's something surface definition function. I can't remember what the B stands for. Anyway, so this is where you set the properties of your material. So the thing that you're always going to use if you want something with color is the default base color. Big Daddy surface function. So if you change your base color, you can change the overall color of your object. So if we were going for something like a more stylized rock, we could just go in here and choose a single color, which might look cool if you're wanting to go for a stylized look. But since we did download those texture packs, we can use the images in here. So to the right of that, you'll see a little circle. If you click on that, you can select under texture, image texture. You're going to go into more detail on more complex ways to do this, but this is the quickest way to set it up. And then under that, it'll now give you a new and open thing. So we just open and choose the color texture over here. So if you open that up, you should see now, if you zoom in, you've got more interesting color information on your texture, which already makes it look pretty cool. And of course, if you have more subdivisions, it might match up a little bit better. So that's what the base color is. So I'm just going back to the material settings over here. But then you've got all these other options over here. We're not going to work with all of them, but what's going to add a whole lot of detail to your object is almost all the way at the bottom over here. There's a thing called normal. So if you remember, normal means the angle of the surface at the point. And as it is, we've already got a whole lot of faces and stuff. Turn down the weight of the vertex group. So just go into your displacement setting and change just that individual displacement. You can, under the vertex group, change individual stuff and paint that stuff, but we're not going to get into that today. So for this, the easiest thing is to just change the strength with the one modifier that is affected by that vertex group. We're going to get into not normals, no. So under the normal, we can do the same thing of saying add a, I'm going to have to scroll up because for some, wait, why is it no? No, we want to say normal map under vector, normal map, because it's not exactly using a texture, you're using a thing called a normal map, and under that then you'll get color. So it's just one more step. So a normal map means it's going to use a specific kind of texture, and I'll explain that to you now. So under color, the same way we did for the base color, with a little circle next to it, click on that and choose an image texture, and that'll give you the option to choose and open a new one. So we're going to say open, and you'll see that you should have a rock normal texture. So if I open that up, it looks a little bit weird. Everything has sort of gone dark. So this is where I was talking about earlier, the color space. The normal map is not using colored data. It's a colored image, but you're not using it for color. You're using it for non-colored data. So if you click on color space, change sRGB to non-color. It affects the way it processes information. Then you'll see that you get so much more detail. So I'm going to do a quick sort of explanation of how this works. So if I open up this texture, you'll see that you get these weird colors, so it's like purples and pinks and stuff. If I actually open this up in Photoshop, I can probably explain it a little bit better. Might take a little bit of a while. But what this is doing is actually packing, it's called texture packing, different bits of information into each color. So RGB, because images are red, green, and blue on your computer. So it's packing different information into each channel. So that's why you're getting this sort of bright mix of colors. So if I go into Photoshop over here and switch to the channels, so this will just allow me to view each of the individual colors. So if I click on red, you'll see you sort of get something that sort of looks like a photograph. If I go into green, you'll see you sort of get another photograph, but like from a different lighting. And if I go to blue, it's even different. So what this actually is doing, it's packing information in on the normals of the object. So it's using red, green, and blue as X, Y, and Z coordinates. I will have a look just now. And it's basically saying this is what the surface of this texture looks like from each of these directions. So you're basically packing the surface normal of each point from each direction in this. So you get a lot more detail than you would just from a mesh of this quality. So you see it's basically each point here looked at from a different direction in lighting almost. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's have a look in the Discord. So you might have one of your textures is stretched. Let's see, so you might have one of your displacements set to the wrong coordinate thingy over here. I think that would be it, or your normals are incorrect. You might have your textural coordinates, just make sure you have your UVs selected. Might be that as well. Try those and see if it fixes. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about, where when you extrude things, you might get these sort of stretchy things like this. So just with yours, Glenn, just select those faces, so the ones that look wrong. Go into face mode, select those ones, and then under UV say reset, and then that will reset the UV coordinates, because as it is, your UV coordinates are taking like 1 pixel and stretching it out to the whole face, so you want to actually just have the whole face reset. Hope that makes sense. Yeah, okay, so now let me know if those things fix and we can come back to it. We should have a, you might just have to rotate them again or something. So we've got some basics of the texture over here. We've got some lighting information baked into the texture with the normal maps and stuff, and it looks pretty cool. So just keep those faces that you wanted selected, just those specific wrong ones, and then go into your UV editor again, and then select all. It'll only be selecting all the selected ones, and then if you rotate that, because you wanted yours 45 degrees because of your 45 degree texture, if you then go back into your 3D viewport, those specific ones only should be rotated. So you should see, like mine, just those faces are now rotated 45 degrees. So with the textures that we got, we've used the color, we've used displacement, and we've used normal. So those should make sense to you. I didn't actually explain what the displacement does. It basically says white is high and black is low. That's all it does. So that's how it uses that information. But then we've got 2 other ones. We're only going to use one more. Ambient occlusion we don't actually need to use because Blender will generate that for us. But there's one called roughness. So roughness bakes into its data about the roughness of the surface. So that's sort of how shiny and glossy and or rough and rocky basically it is. So if we go into our material, there is a thing called roughness that corresponds to this. So if I just change that between 0 and 1, just manually, you see if I go down to 0, 0 roughness means it's not rough. So it's going to be super sort of glossy, sort of shiny sort of surface, which can be cool. But it's not really rock in this case. It would be wet rock. But if we put it on 1, it looks more sort of natural rocky. But we have the image, which will give you nice variation to that. So we just need to scroll up in there, choose image texture, open, and find our roughness texture. I'm going to switch this to non-color data, but it shouldn't make much difference for this. So you won't see a huge difference, but there will be some variation on this, which when you sort of rotate the sun and stuff will give you a little bit of variation onto how it looks, which just makes things look a bit more natural. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, because now I'm gonna complicate things up. Yeah, I think it's something wrong with your UV map. Try the thing that I said to Glenn, where you select all your edges and say, or all your faces, and say, go select your object, edit mode, select all your faces. So just say A to select all faces, UV reset. I think that might fix your issue. Glenn, you want me to re-explain the roughness? Okay, so just like we did the color map, under roughness, if you click to the side of that little white circle, select image texture, and then it'll give you the option for opening or creating a new thing, and say open, and select your roughness, which should do the trick. There are a bunch of other things over here, but these are the main things you need to define a normal surface. For other things, we could look at these other settings, but we'll get into that later on. So a roughness of 0 will be super shiny, and a roughness of 1 will be like sand or paper, I don't know, something that's not shiny. So roughness, go to the little circle on the right. You might have to scroll up because sometimes it hides the image texture thing over here, so use the mouse wheel to scroll up, find image texture, and then you should get a thing saying open or new. So select open and find your roughness. Yeah, so by default with some of these things you'll get, it just says like light path or something, so you just need to scroll up. I do find that a little bit annoying. I don't know why it does that. So under texture you should find image texture there. Yeah, sorry, it's become a habit for me. I open up that setting and I scroll up and I forget that I'm doing it, which is not great when I'm trying to give a tutorial. It's like one of these weird quirks of Blender that I don't know why it happens like that. I mean, there's space on the screen, they can just add another little panel over there instead of having it a scrollable thing. I don't know. And there's like all this other stuff that's not being used in there. Probably an easy fix. So I'm just going to switch into the textured view. So this is the material preview, so without lighting. And it looks cool, but we can still see that repetition again. So every face then starts repeating with this little dark corner over here, which if you look at it like this is extremely apparent. So I showed you now the basic way to create a material. Now I'm going to move into a more advanced way, the better way to create a material. It's actually in a way easier. So I'm going to do that thing again of going in the top right hand corner of the 3D viewport, left clicking and dragging down. You can also go to the left if you want, but I'm going down. And I'm going to switch one of these views into the shader editor. And you'll see that what we've done over here, adding these different things, is actually creating a node diagram over here with our principal BSDF shader. And I'm just going to drag them around so you can see. We've got our color, we've got our roughness, and we've got our normal map. This is just now in a graph view. And now we can start making things a little bit more complicated. Because if you just work in the material tab over here, you can just sort of add one thing and it's not easy to work with. What we're going to do now is why I mainly wanted you to download 2 texture packs. That's because we're going to blend between 2 textures. So we're going to take our color, we'll start working with this, just read it should say rock color, and you should see that it's connected to your base color. So we're going to select that, and I'm going to say Shift D to duplicate it. So then we get a second node. I just find it easier to work this way. You can just say add texture, image texture. It does the same thing. In this case, I find it easy to just duplicate it. That's a good idea, yeah. If you found the solution, let people know. Otherwise the Discord will become a one of those forums where people come looking for an answer and some guy 10 years ago found a solution but never told them how to do it. Sad days, sad days. Okay, so once we've duplicated that node, we're going to just select open, and now we're going to move into another folder where we've got more textures, and I'm going to select the second color texture. So now I've got rock 22 and rock 28. So if I just swap this, I'm going to drag the color from this out to the base color. It's basically swapping the 2 textures. But this is not the texture that was designed for this displacement, so it might look a little bit weird. But it just swaps them, it doesn't like blend between them. You can only have the one or the other selected at a time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a color. So at the top here, add color mix RGB. So if that makes sense, mix RGB will mix 2 colors. So if I add that on, I'm just going to drag it over the line. You see when I drag it over that line that goes between the texture and the base color, it sort of highlights. So that's just a quick way to slot it in. So that'll then connect the color to the first color and the color output to the base color. You could just say add the mix, add color mix RGB, and then manually drag in color to color 1 and output color to base color. It's essentially the same thing. So then what we can do is we can drag in the second texture's color and put it into color 2. So what this is doing at the moment is saying it's mix by a factor of 0.5 between color 1 and color 2. So if I do factor 0, what it's saying is just do everything color 1. If I do it factor 1, it's saying everything in color 2. If I do it 0.5, it's halfway between the two. So you see as I slide that along, it sort of blends between the two. If you've used something like Photoshop or GIMP or whatever, if you click on mix, you'll see a drop down that gives you all these other options, so like darken, multiply, and things like that. So you can have these textures blend through a multiply or an overlay or any other variety of things. For now, I'm just going to leave it on mix and put it on 0.5, but we're going to come back to that. It gives us a little bit more variety, but they're still tiling in the same method, so the repetition will still be the same. What you will notice though is that each of these textures has an input. So just like the mix and the main thing has these little dots on the side, those are inputs. The texture itself has an input for a vector. So what we can do is we can say this second texture, let's change how it's laid out. So let's tile it in a different way. So just like you're sort of editing the UVs earlier, we can do that in the shader with one texture. So I'm going to say add, and I'm going to say, what am I going to do? I'm going to say input UV map. So we've already created a UV map by resetting the UVs, so you should have that square mapping. So under input UV map, you'll get basically exactly what it's doing now. So if I drag UV to vector, it should be identical because it's the same basic thing. By default, it should just do that. And you see it doesn't actually change anything when I slot that in. But what we can do is we can use that output from the UV map and connect it to a vector operation over here called mapping or vector transform, doesn't matter which one you use, but we're just going to use mapping. And if I slot that on between these two, it'll put the UV input into vector, and then that'll connect it to here, and we can change how this scales. So if I just put this factor to 1, so we're just seeing this texture, as I scale this, you'll see it scales the image across like this. We're getting this funny sort of blend because we're going between like whole numbers and mid numbers. So what we want to do is we want to add sort of a high detail sort of variation over here. So I'm going to put this at like 8 for every direction. We'll get a lot of repetition. Maybe we should lower that down a little bit because you can see some repetition going on over here. If for some reason it's not repeating for you, you'll see there's an option here called repeat. If it's on clip, you'll see that it just puts one little corner of texture. So we want it onto repeat. So that will repeat the UV as you go. You can also then just move this, you can rotate it, which can look a bit weird if you've got funny UVs. So, depending on the texture that you have and how it tiles and things, usually you want to keep it mapped to your UVs. We still get a bit of repetition over here. That's because it's a repeating texture still. So what we're going to do some of you might have figured this out, is that we can vary this factor over the whole thing. But what if we vary that by certain bits of the thing? So this is where we can start using procedural textures. And if I say add texture, and then I'm going to select, let's go for Musgrave. I don't know which way you're supposed to say that. Don't slot it in onto the color. You want to just add that blank. So let's add texture, Musgrave. Just put that in the middle of nowhere. And then we're going to use the factor output of that to the factor input of the mix. So what this will do is it'll create a noise texture and then vary that across the thing and blend between the two different textures. So if I just mess around with the scale of this, all the different values over here, you'll see how it sort of changes the surface of this object. Maybe you want it big. Get a little bit more detail in the noise or something. It helps a lot. But that's only doing it on the color. What we can do is basically repeat this whole process that we've done for the base color and do it for the roughness and the normal map. That way we'll get a really nice overall blend, because we're still getting the normal map over here, which adds a whole lot of surface detail. If I just have it with the base color, it will look a little bit more, you'll see more of this difference. So basically what we can do is just duplicate each of these textures. So Shift D and open the second texture. So the normal, I'm going to open the normal, and then do the same thing of add a color mix, slot it in between, add the other one, and then we can just reuse the output from this noise. So I'm just going to zoom out, grab that, and slot that into the mix over here. And don't forget, when you open your normal map, to set it to non-color. So now, let me just zoom so you can sort of see it a little bit better. If I change this noise, we get a lot of changes across the whole object. And then we can do that to the roughness as well. So Shift D, open, select your second texture, find the second texture roughness, add color, mix RGB. This time I'm just going to do it manually. I don't want to use the alpha, I want to use the color. I don't know why I'd use the alpha for that. So I'm going to drag the color from the one roughness into color 1, color from the other roughness into color 2, and the output color into roughness. And then I'm just going to use the same output from the noise. If you can't see your thing, you might just have to zoom out or scale things or stuff and drag the output into the input of the mix. And if you're finding you're not getting enough contrast in your noise over here, you could add a something like, let's see, maybe a Let's just do it with a brightness contrast, because that's easy to understand. So if we take a brightness contrast from the output of that noise and put it into the mix for the color and just up the contrast, you can see how this will give you maybe a sharper mix between them, or you can lower it down and get a softer mix between things. You can use something like a curves or levels or something over here. So this way you can get some sort of nice variations and just really adjust them as you see fit. And you can go extremely crazy. You can add multiple levels of noise, and you can add your own, like maybe that's cool, but you now want to add maybe even more. So you can add like another mix RGB, and we go to the base color, and then we can just directly add let's use a Voronoi texture. Use that output in this, and you'll see that's a funny looking one right now. Let's actually use the distance instead of color, and we can mess around with this, put it into smooth mode, change the scale, and then make this into maybe a multiply or whatever. So then you can add a whole lot of variations and things with procedural textures as well. So we're going to go into more detail on that sort of stuff later. There's just two more things I want to show you today that will really sort of start making this look natural. So we've got a little bit of variation in this. It doesn't all look the same, and if we're looking at it from the side like this, it looks even better. There's still a little bit of repetition, but that's in the displacement now, because we were getting that issue where it wasn't showing both, giving us the option for both textures, and I don't know why that was. So let me just go into rendered view. Just rotate it a little bit so the sun looks cool. So I want to do one last step to really show you how I can work with procedural materialing stuff and make things look a little bit realistic. So this is a cliff face that's next to a river. So since it's next to a river, the bottom part will be getting wet and damp and mossy and stuff like that. So what we can do is, with what we've got here already, we can say, well, how that will work is we just want the bottom, so lower bits of this, to firstly get darker and then get less rough, so shiny. So we can add another texture here called a gradient texture. So a gradient will just be a gradient. If I just replace the base color with this, and let's just switch into material view, you'll see that it's basically going from black at the top to white at the bottom, which is sort of okay. Yours might be going from the left to the right though. So if yours is going from the left to the right, or in my case it's going from the top to the bottom when we want it to go from the bottom to the top, we just want to do the same thing of using a mapping to change it. So I'm just going to add a vector mapping node, add that in, connect that to the vector, and we'll see something funny has happened. actually wait, we need to use the input from the texture coordinate, not a mapping node. We want to use input texture coordinate and drag the generated texture coordinates into the vector. So not the UV, but the generated texture. So this is just the world coordinates sort of stuff. So let's just swap things around here. So if I now start changing this, you'll see I can change how this gradient is fitting on here. So I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees, and then I'm going to lower it on the, might have to mess around to find things. Z is not working, it's on the X. This is why you would want to apply your object coordinates, because you get a little bit weird. So now we get a gradient that goes from white to black at the bottom, but it's quite diffuse sort of gradient. We want it to be a little bit sharper because the water won't reach 10 meters up in the air or so. So we can scale this texture. So I'm going to scale it by 10 and then just move it back down a little bit more. Maybe scale it up a little bit more so it's a tighter gradient. And I'll put it like at that point. So we can imagine the water line to be somewhere around here. So what we can then do is we can use this. I just put it in the base color so we can visualize what's happening with this. We really want to be using this. So if we take this output that we previously created and then create another color mix to jack that into, we can take the output from this gradient into that and then multiply that, or you can do an overlay or something depending on how it looks, and then put that into the base color. And then if I just mess around with the strength of this, we get this sort of darker patch near the bottom. So this is where it's sort of getting wet and mossy or whatever. And you know, when things get wet, they get sort of darker. So this sort of will emulate that. And we can use this again with the roughness. So if we create a color mix from the roughness input over here and use the same one onto the color over here, and we can do a dark and we can do a multiply. Let's do a multiply. Then if we adjust the strength of that, we get this shiny bit at the bottom where it's going to be wet. So you can adjust that strength as you see fit. So I'm going to leave mine sort of like 0.6 something or so. So it's not pure shiny, but it gives you this sort of feel, if you zoom in to the right level, of that edge of a cliff where things are just splashing and getting wet and things like that. So you see, you don't need programs like Substance Painter or Substance Designer to do this sort of stuff, but they do make things easier. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. You guys have been pretty quiet. I don't know if I've been going a little bit fast with this section, because I want to get one last step done. So you should have 2 cliff walls. Okay. I'll repeat this stuff. I just want to finish what I wanted to show, and then I'll come back and repeat some of these things. So for the people who are caught up, the next step that can be fun to experiment, I'm going to add a new mesh, a plane, In fact, it doesn't really matter what. Yeah, could be that. Just mess around with your coordinates and stuff. Swap things around and change the scale and stuff. So I've just created a plane. Let's just scale it up a little bit. We're going to start adding water now. Scaling it up actually won't make any difference because we're going to add something new here. So I'm going to add a special modifier to this, because creating water from scratch will be, let's say, difficult. But Blender has a really cool modifier that's super fun to play with. So under the modifier properties, on the right hand side, you'll see there's a bunch of them called simulate. A lot of these are more complicated things that you need to do stuff in other places, but there's one here called ocean. And if I click and add that, it sort of creates and changes this sort of thing. Looks a little bit weird. If I just change the various size things over here, change the scale of the waves, and maybe scale the whole thing down or something. I'm just going to have to experiment a little bit to get this right. I'm going to scale it. Something like this. I'm going to just up the resolution a little bit. I'm just going to mess around with all these different things just to get something that looks a little bit natural. So for this you just have to play around with scaling and adjusting spatial size and size until you get something that looks natural. And you can also switch between turbulent ocean and something like shallow water, because this would be more shallow water. And then what you can do is you can say repeat along the Y, so you get a longer thing, and maybe repeat along the X twice. So that will give you sort of a duplicated thing. You can just move this around, slide it down to your water level somewhere over here. And I'm just going to add a new material. And all I'm going to do for this is put the roughness down to 0, because water is shiny, and I'm going to change the base color to sort of a dark bluey green. That way you can sort of see the surface of the water a little bit better, and then you can come back to your modifier and either add more resolution, change the size so you get smaller waves, add more repetition so it goes further down the river and stuff like that. You don't want your resolution to go too high though, because again you'll run into slow down and stuff. And that already starts to make it look like water. But it even has a little thing here under time where you can animate the water and it will make the waves splish and splosh and slide, and you can do stuff like change the velocity and stuff. We're not going to do animation, so that doesn't matter. So that way you've got something that starts to look like water. Okay, so I'm going to go and repeat all this stuff, but if you've caught up, you can start messing around and making your river sort of fit in with the scene. Changing the size of your things, changing the scale of your waves. This is a pretty rough water stuff in the story, so you can have fun with that. So I'm just going to quickly save this. Okay, so let's go back to the mixing and blending of this. I've got a horrible graph of shaders over here. I'm going to create it from scratch for you guys. So I'm just going to go create a new material. Edit my objects, select all my faces, and assign it to this, just so I can show you from scratch. The water is not important, we'll go back to that next week, or Thursday. That's like a 5-minute thing, but I just wanted to get it in. Sorry. But I'm just going to go and show you the material stuff from scratch. So, base color is the surface color of the object. So I'm going to add texture, image texture, and open my main color. And if I apply that to the base color, that applies the surface color. But we want to blend that between two textures so we get some variation on the surface. So if I add another texture, image texture, and open my second one, so the color as well, and add a color mix RGB, we can blend between the two and get a little bit variation between the two, and that's controlled by the factor. And if you want to control the factor with another thing, so you can do that with like a texture or something, we can slot in one of the procedural textures. So let's use the foray texture in this case. And I'm just going to drag one of the outputs so that you can use the color or the distance, doesn't really matter for this. And that'll use this texture to blend between the two other textures. And then you can get some nice variety in the surface of your object. And we can do the exact same thing with things like the roughness. So if I add a new texture, image texture, add the roughness, and then add the second roughness, so the second texture set, we can do the same thing of adding a color mix RGB. So this just mixes the two colors, drag color into color 1 and other color into color 2, and we put that into roughness and use the same noise on the mix. We can blend the two roughnesses. Just remember that this is a roughness texture, so you want to make sure that your textures are set to non-color. And then just the last repetition is the exact same thing 3 times, except this time with the normal, we're just adding a vector normal map, putting that into the normal, and into the normal we're going to add 2 image textures, so the normal of the first one and the normal of the second map. Oops, no, we want to add that into a mix RGB, forgot that step. But basically the exact same thing as before, except we're slotting it into the normal map and slotting the normal map into the normal settings. And from there you can adjust the strength of your normals. So you can make it super craggy if you make your strength very high. I didn't actually show you this before. And I'm just going to pop that noise output into the blend of this. So this way we can get some nice variety between the two. And if you really want to sell the non-repeating thing, we can add a input from the texture coordinates and multiply the texture coordinates. So that's the UVs that we've got with a mapping node. So if we take the UV of the texture coordinates, pop that into the vector, and pop that into the second texture map of all these ones. Just make sure that you keep them consistent, otherwise it'll look a bit weird. Then you can start changing and having varying overlaps between different things. So if we go to 3 times scale or something, we get some repeating but non-repeating sort of things. If we just adjust the intensity of this, it'll just break up how these textures blend. And you can do that with whatever type of texture you want, with whatever settings and stuff as well. Just experiment with that. So in this case it looks like there's a lot of repetition, but I just quickly set this one up, so you can have that maybe 2 instead. And remember, this is most likely going to be viewed from below or something like that, so it doesn't need to be too crazy. Or maybe we can just take that out of the normals and just do a straight blend between them. There's nothing right or wrong, just what looks right in this case. So to add the waterline stuff, what I did is I added a gradient texture input. So a gradient just creates a gradient in space, and we just want to map that around. So if I just replace the color with this, we can see that in my case it goes from black at the top to white at the bottom. Yours might go from black on the left to white on the right, or the other way around, or something like that. So we just want to add the input for the texture coordinates of the object, and you get this thing called generated textures, which is just what Blender does to give a texture to the object's space. So it does that for all objects. In this case it's nice to work with because it's just default by the object sort of mesh. Not really explaining that well. And then we're going to modify that with the mapping thing again, pop the generator coordinates into the vector, and pop this vector into the gradient textures vector. And there we can rotate this around to fit whatever works for your thing. In my case it's a 180-degree rotation, and then sliding it down along the X in my case. For yours it might be the Z or the Y. And then also, because I want this gradient to be much shorter, I'm just scaling it up in the X and then bringing it back down just to near the waterline over there. So this will be our bits that get splattered along the surface of the river. So then we can bring back the rough color input that we had before, and we're going to blend that with a mix RGB and put that into the base color. So I'm just going to use a multiply in this case. You can mess with different things. You can use a darken perhaps. Just really depends on the texture that you have. And then you just, in this case, if you're doing a darken or multiply, you just want to make it 100%. Or actually no, it's because I had them the wrong way around. You want to use the second input as your gradient, because that way when you adjust the blending you keep the main texture there. So if you put that in and you're getting it down to white and black, just swap them around. So then you can just have this darkening effect at the bottom over here. And we can do the exact same thing with the roughness. So we're just going to add a color mix, put this gradient color output into number 2, do the same thing with the roughness mix, and then put this into the roughness. I'm going to use a darken in this case because I want to make sure that this bit gets shinier. And you can just choose whatever looks good to you. So the water thing was just adding a plane or whatever, then adding an ocean modifier. So it will replace the geometry of the plane and make it into this ocean. You see, saying geometry generate. You can also make it displace the plane if you want, but in this case it's actually quite nice. Actually no, let me try something. I wonder if I use, let me just try something here. You can safely ignore this, this is just me experimenting. I'm just going to grab this edge. I just want to see if it will displace a generated thing nicely. You can ignore this step. Separate. So I'm just making a direct copy of my river base by separating it out from the cliffs. And then, oops, no. Deleted those from the wrong ones. So let's see what happens if I add this ocean to that. It went crazy. Displace. Yeah, it doesn't like that. Unless if I apply, so this is me just experimenting. Apply object transform. Let's add in subdivision. I just want to see if this works a little bit easier, so then we can just make a river fit exactly where we want. I haven't tried this before. Jeez, crazy. Yeah, it actually does work. Sort of. But this is not something that you can really just give one prescribed number to. You've got to sort of experiment with these to find something that works for your scene, because your cliffs might be 500 meters long, or yours might be like 20 centimeters long in the scene. So you just got to adjust these to fit your thing. Yeah, so this doesn't work nicely because it doesn't auto displace. You would have to add your subdivision surface to it and then have the river modifier work on that. So for this, I'm just going to add a new material. I'm going to call this water. I'm going to make it 0 roughness, so it's super shiny. And I'm going to make its color, depending on what kind of river you want. You might want a nice dark blue, or you might want sort of a murky sort of thing. I'm going to go somewhere sort of between sort of teal and green and go fairly dark. Maybe a little bit more blue. Why is this not showing anything? What have I done? So you can either just be experimenting with a plane or try something like this, but it should be basically the same. Thing of just adding the modifier and then just messing with spatial size, wave scale, resolution, general size, and you can add some repeating. Yeah, so it might be you might have duplicated it or something. Is it adding all those modifiers? If you want to apply the material, go into edit mode, select all the faces. The thing is with this one, if you're just adding it to a plane, it's replacing it so you don't have any geometry. If you're doing what I did and making a river shaped piece of it, you will have this option. Otherwise you just want to go add a new material and it should fit in if you added the new geometry. If you did what I did, then you want to go into edit mode, select all the faces, so you can go into face mode, select edge loop, select those, add a new material with the plus, click new, and then say assign, and we'll assign that material to the selected faces. If you didn't separate the meshes, then you'll still get all the modifiers over here. So you want to select those faces and say separate by selection. You can also do separate by material and loose parts, but generally it's nicer to do it by selection. But I kind of feel like it's almost easier to just work with the default generated one, because it seems to have more control over generating these waves for some reason. I'm not sure if it was well optimized for applying it to other surfaces. One thing you'll notice, that choppiness kind of makes the waves look pretty weird, because it's trying to add choppy waves, but it's doing it with geometry and it looks odd. So sort of overlapping stuff. Wave scale changes the height of the waves. Spatial size is one form of scaling, and then there's also size itself. So mess with the two of those. Change the settings, and it's a lot easier to see what it looks like if you put on the water shader over here, because just your eye understands the surface better when it's this sort of shiny surface. Can you pop it into Discord with what your this whole left-hand panel? Which step specifically? Just the water? I'll do the water from scratch, I think, because this is just messing around. It's really nothing specific to this. So I'm going to add a mesh, a plane. To this, I'm adding the ocean modifier, which generates this ocean stuff. To that, I'm going into material properties, adding new. And to that, I'm just changing the roughness down to 0, changing the color to something watery. You might be in viewport shading mode, like I'm in material mode. The viewport shading mode is looking weird because we actually don't have reflections turned on. If you go under render settings, you can turn on screen space reflections, which might make things look a little bit more reflecty, because we're in EV, which doesn't do the ordinary reflections. But if you just go into material preview, so the second from the right, you get this nice preview with this sort of reflective thing. So we're going to go into more detail on lighting and stuff next week. So does that make your thing look better? Because all I did was adjust the roughness and the color, and I went into this material preview thing because that's just easier to check how things look. Let me get rid of this, we don't need that. And then onto this, I'm just changing down the sizes, just messing around with these values until I find something that looks like river waves, basically. We don't need that detailed. I wouldn't actually make your resolution that high. Let's have a look. you have got two planes, and one of your planes is hidden and not selected. Are you sure you're working on the correct plane? Because I see you've got your color, but it's not been applied to that. And one of your planes is hidden. Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to make this into a scene now. Guys, I'm going to make a scene. Frickin' Karen. Sorry if anyone's name is Karen. So I'm going to just select my thing. I'm going to duplicate it. I didn't do both of my cliff faces just so it was easier for you to see what I was doing. My computer gets super slow when I'm doing stuff. Okay. Mesh, normals, flip. So the reason why I haven't switched into cycles rendering, which is the one that's much nicer looking, but it's because it's slow. But I'm going to switch onto it now because it's going to make things look nice, but it might mess up the stream a little bit. But it will really make the lighting look a little bit better. Because as it is, when I rotate the sun, we don't really get to see much. I'm going to put the camera sort of down over here, near the water. I'm just going to scale down this water a little bit. Let's add a little bit more detail, 18. I'm just trying to make the water look a little bit more real. So what I'm going to do now, you don't have to do this, but this will just allow you to see that it looks a little bit better. I'm going to turn it into cycles. So cycles is the name of one of the rendering engines in Blender. Eevee is the one that's based on sort of like game engine rendering technology. Cycles is a path tracer. So path tracing is more accurate, but it is way slower. So now you'll see we get proper looking reflections, but the thing starts getting all pixely and stuff when I move it, and my stream quality might have just dropped as my computer struggles. And then I can rotate this around. I'm just trying to find a view that looks nice. You can see my computer starts struggling when I do this. And so we're going to come back and do some more details onto things in this. Like we don't have a very detailed cliff top. Like the cliff top with stuff just gets really cut out. just rotating the sun around. I kind of want it to shine in through this direction, so this sort of western bend in the river. Let's put the camera down. Right near the water, I think. I'm going to remove the repetition so things go a little bit faster. Let's go to 24, pumping up the resolution of the water so it looks nicer. What exactly do you mean? Because there's the camera and then there is the viewport camera. I'm just moving the viewport camera around. Oh, you mean locking the camera itself to the camera? You can say, what is it? View camera. No, what was it? Align active camera to view, so you can move the active camera to the current viewport view. So if I do that now, the camera moves to this point that I'm at. So then I could move the viewport over here, and I can say viewport, align view, align active camera to view, and it moves the camera to that point. I think that's what you meant. Because yeah, I like moving around the viewport like this. You can, however, do that. So it's Control Alt Numpad 0. I can't actually do that because I've set my OBS to use that key for stuff. So that's why I'm not doing that. You can just go press Numpad 0, which will switch you into the camera view, and then you can just manually sort of drag out these views and stuff. Anyway, that's what we're going to cover today. I just wanted to get us to a nice point where we can sort of render something. Next week Thursday, things are going to get more interesting, where we start to combine all the things. So the boats we did in the previous ones, the axe, we're going to bring that and start making the sculptures, and then we're going to get into more things like the sky lighting and atmospheric stuff, maybe making the water transparent and things like that. And like I've noticed, like this scene that I've got here, the wet point is actually quite high up, and my stream just went crazy because I'm doing all this stuff. So if we make this maybe 7, and let's go for like 12, 20. Now that I've actually got the camera down to view level, I can sort of see that things look a little bit weird. This is going to material view because this is going super slow. But yeah, I don't know if you have any questions on what we've got so far. Do you want me to repeat any of the things that we've done? Hopefully you've got sort of a cliff scene with something happening. We'll go into more detail on how to do cool stuff with the camera when we start actually arranging a final shot. I'm just putting this quality down so that my stream doesn't go completely bonkers. And if you want to actually render out a scene from a camera view, just press F12 or say render image from the file menu. And that might take a little bit while because the default render thing is actually a lot more detailed than the viewport render. My stream actually might start cutting out. So that will render from the camera view. So for that you have to do what we were doing just now, moving around the camera in the scene. But yeah, that starts making my stream cut out because it uses all my CPU cores to do stuff. So actually I'm going to stop that as it is. But yeah, hopefully you guys have got something that looks sort of like a cliff with a scene from the Lord of the Rings, sort of, maybe. Any questions, add them into the Discord server. Let me pop that link in over here. And thanks for joining in. I appreciate you guys. I'm gonna say points all 100 for all of you people that are still here. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. You've got sort of the bright blue mountain water as it is, but I like how yours is really craggy and stuff. I think it's just the scaling. But yeah, I actually like yours. It's got that really nice craggy, rocky look to it. It's awesome. It actually feels a lot more ominous than my scene, because mine is a little bit just messed around at the moment. It's got very straight walls and stuff. I didn't go crazy with the displacement. And you actually may have picked a slightly better texture. But anyway, I think we're going to leave that as is, and then on Thursday we'll come back and go crazy. Thanks for joining in. Check that. Bye.